says, "And when Jesus was entered into Capernaum, there came unto him a centurion, beseeching him, and saying, Lord, my servant lieth at home, sick of the palsy, grievously tormented. And Jesus said unto him, I will come and heal him. And the centurion answered and said, Lord, I am not worthy that thou should come under my roof, but speak the word only, and my servant shall be healed. For I am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to this man, Go, and he goeth, and to another, Come, and he cometh, and to my servant, Do this, and he doeth it. When Jesus heard it, he marveled, and said to them that followed, Verily I say unto you, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. And I say unto you that many shall come from the east and west, and shall sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the children of the kingdom shall be cast out into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And Jesus said unto the centurion, Go thy way, and as thou hast believed, so it be done unto thee. And his servant was healed in the selfsame hour. A familiar miracle that we read about in the New Testament. We find Jesus in Capernaum, which was his base of operations at this point in the early days of his ministry. It was a fishing village on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. That's where he finds Peter. That's where Peter had his base of operations. Capernaum was a happening place. It was a place you would go to have your taxes collected. That's why he finds Matthew, the tax collector, the author of this gospel, in Capernaum. Capernaum was the home of there was a highway that passed through Capernaum that connected Syria to Palestine. It was a major highway for people traveling in that time. And because of that, there was a Roman garrison stationed there. And that's no doubt why we find the centurion here. The Roman army, just as a side note to give you an idea of who this centurion was, the Roman army, the Roman Empire at this point had overtaken much of what we think of as Europe today and a significant portion of the Middle East. And all throughout the empire, they had the army scattered to keep order. The army was divided into legions, 30 different legions, each of which had like 4,000 to 6,000 people in it. And then those legions were divided into 10 cohorts, and each of those had about 500 men. And those cohorts were further divided into 6 centuries. Despite the name, you would think it would mean 100, but they had about 80 men in each of those. And each of those centuries was overseen by a centurion. So this was not some low-level rank-and-file soldier. This was a man who had risen through the ranks, likely, and had gained some kind of influence. Centurions were, if you had a centurion in your town, he was a big man in town. He was a representative of the empire. He could be, you could go to him for judicial functions. He kind of functioned as like a justice of the peace, more or less. So he was known to the people of the town. Now, Matthew doesn't tell us a whole lot about this centurion, but the same story is repeated in Luke's gospel. Matthew was writing his gospel for a primarily Jewish audience, whereas Luke was writing for a largely non-Jewish, a Gentile audience. So Luke, acting as kind of a reporter, Luke wrote his gospel after the life of Jesus. He wasn't one of the ones that hung out with Jesus like Mark and Matthew and John were. Luke came to it later, so he would go around and collect first-hand accounts, and that's how he assembled his gospel. Yep. So Luke dives into the character of this centurion a little bit more. In Luke chapter 7, you don't have to turn over there, we learn that in Matthew kind of condenses the story a little bit, but in Luke we learn that it wasn't the centurion that goes directly to Jesus. He gets his Jewish friends, the Jewish leaders of Capernaum, to go to Jesus for him. And when they get to Jesus, they tell him why this centurion would be worthy of meeting his needs, why Jesus should do as this centurion asked. He says, he loves our nation. Which would have been rare because, the Roman Empire the Roman army scattered all throughout the empire. They were a lot of times distrustful of the people that they ruled over, because those people had been conquered and they weren't exactly happy that they were under subjection by Rome. It's also notable that this Roman centurion had gained favor with the local Jewish population, because a lot of times, as you can imagine, an army comes in, takes over your town, you're not going to look at those people too favorably. But this centurion, the leaders say, loves the nation of Israel. He goes so far in that love that he built them a synagogue. Now this is notable for a couple reasons. Romans were usually pagans. They had all kinds of gods. So many that in the book of Acts we find that when Paul was in Athens, he discovered a statue that they'd put up to an unknown god just in case they had missed one. But here was this Roman centurion building a synagogue for the express purpose of the worship of the one true God of Israel. Now, centurions were paid 15 or 16 times what a normal soldier was. But still, this would have been a great sacrifice on his part. You know, archaeologists have done digs in Capernaum, and they uncovered one of the most well-preserved remains of an early synagogue there in Capernaum. It had 2 stories. It was 60 by 80 feet, built of white limestone. And even though they think that this was built in the 2nd or 3rd century, they're pretty sure that it was built on the site of this synagogue that the centurion had built for the local Jewish population. So even as well paid as this man was, it would have been probably years of saving on his part to be able to do this for these people that were underneath him. But you know, those were both outward acts. What the leaders were judging this centurion on were the physical things that he had done, the outward show of affection that he had done. But we know Jesus was able to look upon people's heart. And I think as we read the account here, there are things that are more significant than what those Jewish leaders pointed out. Above this centurion's love for the nation and above his building of that synagogue, there are more things about him that we can learn and more important things about him we can learn. Now, something that was not mentioned by these Jewish elders is how concerned this man was for his servant. Matthew, if you looked at the original Greek version of Matthew, he uses this word name that's pais, P-A-I-S. And it can mean servant, or it can mean boy, as in son. But in Luke, the word that Luke uses is slave. Slave. Not just a servant, not hired help, but this man that the centurion was so concerned about was a slave. Now, in the Roman Empire, slavery was not based on race like we think of it when it was here in the United States. People became slaves in that time because the Roman Empire had conquered their land, and as part of the spoils of the land, in addition to taking all their wealth and all that stuff in their land, they would take people into slavery. So you had slaves of all different nations. But just like the slavery that we had in the American South, slaves in the Roman world were not recognized even as people. There was an ancient Roman writer who said that slaves don't even have a persona. They are not even they don't have a personality. He said they don't have a family. They don't have a name. They were regarded literally as property, as nothing, as less than human. Same as it was here. Less than human. They had no legal rights. If they witnessed a crime occurring, you couldn't call a slave. Even if they were an eyewitness, you couldn't call them to court because they were nothing. Records show that a lot of times when a slave would fall sick, you know what they do? Their master would just throw them out of the house because they weren't any good. It was like a broken blender or something. It was a piece of property. They would just cast them out of their house because what concern is that of mine? They're not even a person. But here this Roman centurion is so concerned. I mean, this is Jesus' kind of love that he's shown to a slave. Somebody that the rest of society looked at as nothing. When this man falls sick, this Roman centurion does not cast him out of his house, but is deeply concerned about his well-being. So much so that he has his friends go, "Do you know anybody? Do you know anybody that could help? No doubt he had been to doctors and tried to give him medicines and stuff like that, but none of that worked. Do you know anybody that can help my beloved slave here? And they said, yeah, there's this man walking around named Jesus, and he's doing amazing things. And the Roman centurion says, well, go get him.
Yeah.
Something else about this centurion. He was humble. Whereas, as we read in Matthew, and like I said, Matthew kind of condenses it, but if we read in Luke, what's actually happening here, these words that the centurion speaks to Jesus are being relayed through second-hand people. First he sends, if you read in Luke, first he sends the local Jewish leaders to talk to Jesus on his behalf. And then as Jesus draws close, evidently that centurion is looking out the window or something because he knows Jesus is drawing close to his house. So he sends friends out to say, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof. I'm not worthy to come to you to speak the word. Now this is a show of respect too, because it was improper for Gentiles to approach Jewish leaders. And even though this centurion was the big man in town, I mean, he had real authority. He could have went up to anybody he wanted to. But he showed deference to Jesus by relying on these Jewish leaders to go to Jesus in his stead. Now when he draws closer and it appears that Jesus is going to enter into that man's house, it would have made a Jewish person ceremonially impure, meaning they couldn't go into the house of God and perform the sacrifices and observances in the house of God. They couldn't go in because if you went into a Gentile person's home, you were impure. And the reasoning was they didn't know what had gone on in that Gentile's house. Most Gentiles were pagans. There could have been idol worship going on in that house. They could have been offering foods and wine to false gods. It would have made Jewish people in their minds, it made them impure to even be around that stuff. But evidently these Jewish leaders liked that synagogue that this centurion built so much that they were willing to make an exception in this case. Nobody's trying to stop Jesus. We also know that Jesus wouldn't have cared because he gets accused of going to all the wrong places and talking to all the wrong people anyway. Jesus, that ain't going to bother Jesus anyway. But that centurion doesn't want to disrespect Jesus, so he says, no, I'm not worthy. My house ain't worthy. I'm not worthy. Don't even come under my roof. But I know you can just speak a word from wherever you're at, and my servant will be healed. And that's the third thing, that when those Jewish leaders go to plead this man's case before Jesus, that's something else they don't mention. The faith. The faith that he had. Faith so great that Matthew tells us here that Jesus marveled at it. Can you imagine how great your faith would have to be to surprise Jesus? He knows everything. Jesus was surprised at the reaction that this man had toward him. He marveled at it. It left Jesus stupefied how great faith this man had. So what is it? I mean, if we look at this man's profession of faith, he believed that Jesus could heal his slave. That's not anything out of the ordinary. There are a lot of people that either come to Jesus in the New Testament by themselves for healing, or they go in for someone else. We think of the men who carried their friend to Jesus on that bed. We think of the father who brought his son to Jesus to be healed. That's not out of the ordinary. What is it that makes Jesus say, this faith is so great that I haven't found anything like it in Israel? Was it that he believed that Jesus could just speak a word and this would happen? I mean, that is a great amount of faith. Nobody was doing this kind of stuff. That would have required a great amount of faith to believe that just a word from this man could heal his servant. But there were other people who asked Jesus to just speak and that it would happen. I mean, we see that with Lazarus. We see that when Jesus is on the ship. All it takes are words for Jesus' will to be accomplished. So it doesn't seem like that's what makes this faith so great. As I dug into it, though, I came to realize something. This faith that the centurion is professing in Jesus is scandalous. So I want you to take the first statement that he makes in Matthew chapter 8. The centurion answered and said, Lord, I'm not worthy. Now today when we say Jesus is our Lord, we usually say He's our Lord and Savior. We think of that as a religious thing. Well, there are other things that centurion could have called Jesus. A lot of people call Jesus rabbi, teacher. No, but this man calls Him Lord. It's not a religious title. It's a political title. It's a title of authority. By saying that someone is your Lord, by that centurion saying that Jesus was his Lord, he was saying that Jesus had authority over him. It puts Jesus, this poor, homeless, itinerant, probably didn't smell so good all the time, preacher, over top of a representative of the most powerful military might on the face of the earth. He called him Lord. Now look at his second statement. For I am a man under authority, having soldiers under me, and I say to this man, go, and he goeth, to another, come, and he cometh, and to my servant, do this, and he doeth. That centurion recognizes Jesus as somebody not just with authority, but with power. He's comparing him to a military leader. He's comparing him with his job as a centurion, as a military leader. He's saying that Jesus has power, that He can command things to be done and they will be done. And he also is admitting here that given the nature of what he's asking, a supernatural healing of his servant, Jesus has command over powers that are far greater than anything the Roman government can provide. That's what he's admitting here. He's admitting that Jesus, just through the mention of a word, can command the very forces of nature to create supernatural events. It's scandalous. I mean, it's one thing for the Jews to look for a Messiah because their prophets had been calling for this for hundreds and hundreds of years. And likely the Romans didn't mind that much as long as the Jews didn't get carried away, because what worry was it for them that some far-off mythic figure, that they believed in some far-off mythic figure, as long as they didn't get too carried away in it. The Romans knew that they had the military muscle to take care of any rebellion that might rise up. So why would they worry about Jewish people looking for some kind of Messiah? But for a Roman to call somebody Lord, that is a title that centurion likely would not have used even for his most superior commanding officers. That is likely a title that centurion would have only used in the presence of one man on the face of the earth, Caesar himself. That Roman soldier was only supposed to have one Lord, Caesar. And to imply that Jesus possessed a power greater than the government, Caesar, like many kings before him and like many kings since, he tried to convince people that he himself was divine. Caesar in the Roman government was deified. They viewed him as a god. You know, if they would have pulled a coin out, in addition to the picture of the emperor, it would have come with an inscription that said, Divi Filius. You know what that means? Son of God. On their coins was a picture of Caesar with the inscription, Son of God. That Roman soldier was only supposed to have one Lord, and he was only supposed to trust in one deity to take care of him, the government of Rome, Caesar himself. But in making this profession of faith to Jesus, that centurion is setting all of that aside. Can you imagine what would have happened if his superiors had found out that this representative of the government was talking to this Jewish preacher this way? It would have been completely scandalous. He could have lost everything. This was a man who had money. He had influence. He had respect. He had connections. But when that slave that he so dearly loved was sick, none of that other stuff mattered. He could have appealed. He could have traveled to Rome, appealed directly to Caesar himself, and it would not have done that slave any good. When it came down to it, the money failed him. The respect failed him. The connections failed him. The emperor failed him. The empire failed him. The government failed him. In this statement of faith, by calling Jesus Lord and saying that he has authority with just a word to do whatever he wants, this man is saying none of that stuff matters, because none of it can help me when it comes to the thing I need most. That centurion wasn't just saying, I believe you can heal my servant. He is saying, take this whole world and give me Jesus. That is the kind of faith that makes Jesus marvel. This man had everything he could need, but he said, if it means losing all of it, take this whole world and give me Jesus. Now, I would be remiss before sitting down if I didn't mention one crucial mistake that this centurion made. There's no way for us to know for sure. But if we take Luke's and Matthew's account together, it is entirely possible that centurion made this great statement of faith.
Come on, Zach.
Saw his beloved servant healed, and never once met Jesus face to face. If we look at Luke's account, he's always speaking through other people. When Jesus says here, verily I say unto you, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. He's not saying, look at that scripture. He's not saying that to the centurion. Jesus is speaking those words to those that follow him. This great act of faith, so great that it is recorded in the New Testament twice. It is entirely possible that this man left this experience never having looked on Jesus' face himself. And it's all because the centurion felt that he was unworthy to be in Jesus' presence. Humility is a great thing. God wants us to be humble. But not so humble that we underestimate how loved we are by God. The centurion missed out probably on the best thing that could have ever happened to him. Likely missed out on it because he felt himself unworthy. Which is ridiculous. Because right before this, the whole thing was, the centurion says, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy. If you come to me, you'll be unclean. That didn't bother Jesus one bit. If you look in the same chapter of Matthew, right before Jesus heals this centurion's servant, he is touching a leper. Jesus is laying hands on somebody that has a communicable disease so bad that they have to be outcast from their society because nobody wants to get close to him. But Jesus not only heals him, he goes to him and touches him. After this, Jesus goes to Peter's house where his mother-in-law is sick. It would have been improper for a Jewish preacher, for a rabbi, to even touch a woman, let alone a sick woman. But what does Jesus go into Peter's house and he lays his hands on Peter's mother-in-law and heals her? Jesus is not concerned about getting our sin cooties on him. This Roman centurion was so humble that he underestimated, he did not appreciate how much Jesus wanted to meet him. That theme reveals itself again and again. Yes, that centurion was unworthy, but so was the woman at the well. Yes, the centurion was unworthy, but so was the woman caught in adultery. Yes, the centurion was unworthy, but so was Legion. And Mary Magdalene and Lazarus, if he had touched a dead body, he would have been made impure. The woman with the issue of blood would have made Jesus impure. So was Matthew himself, the very author. He was unworthy to come to Jesus. He was an enemy of his own people. He was a tax collector. But none of that ever mattered to Jesus. The centurion had enough faith to see his servant healed, but yet not quite enough to come and meet Jesus. This is almost what Jesus is talking about here in verse 11. He says, many shall come from the east and the west and shall sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But then he says, that, and I'm a firm believer that Jesus should make us nervous sometimes. You know what I mean? He says, the children of the kingdom, the ones who should know best, shall be cast out into outer darkness, and there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. There are people who will come so close to having a relationship with Jesus, but not have quite enough faith to go on and have an actual relationship with Him. There are people who can recognize God for who He is, just like this centurion did. Recognize Him for what He's done, believe in Him, but not have quite enough faith to take that one extra step and call Him Lord, and mean it, and follow Him. So before I sit down, I want to tell you that if you're here and you have a need, you might not feel worthy to come to Jesus. You might feel tempted to have your friends, like that centurion did, come and speak to Him on your behalf. And that'll work. You can have people pray for you. But let me tell you something, it's so much better when you make the direct connection yourself. Jesus will meet your needs. He will. But more than that, Jesus just wants to meet you. No amount of our dirtiness can ever defile Jesus. Don't worry about that. He is so good at getting right down in the muck and the mire with us. He can do mighty and wonderful things. But the greatest thing of all is that He takes dirty, unworthy people like us and makes them presentable to God. Not through anything we do. And Woozy, that made me so blessed this morning. How many of us have tried to clean our own selves up?
Yes. and
just failed? You just make it worse. But when we finally realize that we have to trust in Jesus to do it, to exhibit faith, that's the kind of thing that makes Jesus marvel. Faith. Take this whole world. Take everything the world's ever given me. But give me Jesus.
Yeah.